Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place to get spoon-fed the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. This is the audio version of the past week's summaries, which this week were brought to you by our authors, Alex Clark, Kimiko Dunbar, Joshua Belfer, Doug Wallace, Jason Lesnick, and Clay Smith. Okay, let's have the third article, titled Intravenous Rehydration for Severe Acute Malnutrition with Gastroenteritis, out of the New England Journal of Medicine. We don't talk that much about underdeveloped countries here on the podcast, but occasionally we do. And of course, it's very relevant because there are millions of children who are malnourished and dehydrated across the globe. Severe acute dehydration coupled with malnutrition can carry a mortality of up to 41%, which of course is terrible. IV hydration has been recommended against because of the possibility of causing cardiac dysfunction and failure and sodium overload. That is currently the recommendation that the WHO gives, is that you should not hydrate with IV hydration in these children. However, the majority of these children are very young, very malnourished, and they cannot take oral fluids on their own. Even in this sample, 93% of these children needed a nasogastric tube. So that has complications and things associated with it as well. Could we just put an IV? Would this be something that we could do? There's not a lot of data backing up the WHO recommendation. And that's what these authors wanted to get to the bottom of. Now, they were in 4 countries: Uganda, Kenya, Niger, and Nigeria. Mostly just Niger and Nigeria, but there were 4 countries total that were included in this. And they wanted to look at a couple different approaches for rehydrating sick kids, very young as well, 6 to 12 years old, who were malnourished and had gastroenteritis with dehydration. Now, according to their power calculations, they estimated that just about 60% of these children would die as a result of this. And so it wouldn't be that hard to find a significant difference, and they only had to recruit 272 children to try to find a difference between IV hydration and oral hydration. And they didn't just do IV hydration, they also broke it down into a couple of different regimes. They looked at slow IV hydration, which was 100 cc's per kg of Ringer's lactate over 8 hours, versus a slightly faster method, which was still 100 cc's per kg, but over 3 to 6 hours. Now, short-term and longer-term out to 28 days mortality rates were comparable between the two groups. And importantly, despite the fear of IV hydration, there was no cases of pulmonary edema or heart failure observed. Also, the rates of severe adverse events were comparable between the groups. But the major limitation on this trial was that they only had an 11% mortality. So they had a way lower risk of mortality than they thought they would have, which was just nearly 70%, actually it was 68%, but nearly 70% is how much mortality they thought they would see. And why is this? It's probably because you were taking better care of these kids. So because of the study protocols, these children were being watched quite closely and had quite intensive care, more intensive care than they would probably normally have. And thus they were getting better than the typical standard in these regions. They knew that this would probably happen, but they couldn't not do it for ethical concerns. Though this definitely does affect the generalizability of these results, because after this study is done, it's hard to make a recommendation compared to what the care usually is in these places. And to me, that feels like the most significant finding here. If you got a hypothetical almost 60% decrease in mortality just by watching these kids a bit better and really making sure that they were better hydrated, that sounds like a really significant finding. It doesn't seem to matter if you give oral or IV hydration to these children if they're getting this amount of care. Now, of course, I do not practice in this kind of environment, and so I really should not and will not comment very much on this. I think this is going to be up to people who do practice in those kinds of environments, exactly what they want to do with this information. In a spoonful, this certainly needs to be studied further, especially seeing how mortality rates improved with just watching these kids better. But it would seem that rehydration via oral or IV hydration is both okay for malnourished children who are dehydrated due to gastroenteritis. Seems like the most important thing is just rehydrating them well and having a bit more resources. Okay, and then the fifth article, titled Association Between Immediate Defibrillation and Outcomes in Shockable Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest, a Propensity Score Analysis, out of the Journal of Pre-Hospital Emergency Care. Now, there's always been kind of the question, so do you shock as soon as you can, or is it better for you to establish and continue that kind of low-flow CPR state for a little while just to make sure that you are circulating something in the meantime? So either have this kind of longer delay of more nothing so you can get that shock in right away, or you just focus on your CPR initially so you can get at least some stuff circulating. Of course, the other side is if you do get that shock and they do get ROSC, then everything's going to circulate a whole lot better that way. As a result, there are sort of mixed opinions on exactly what to do. This study was from Japan. It was a nationwide study from 2010 to 2019. It was retrospective and observational, looking at all their registry data on about 34,000 OHCAs, out-of-hospital cardiac arrests, to compare patients who got a shock within 2 minutes of EMS arrival and CPR or over 2 minutes. Actually, 2 to 4 minutes, because if you waited a really long time, then they eliminated those patients as well. And what they found was it seemed like the longer you wait to defibrillate, the lower the survival. It's not a very steep trend, but really it looked like it came from less than 1 minute to all the way up to 4 minutes. There was a difference of almost 10% in survival, which is actually really quite significant. But if you just compare overall the less than 2 minutes to the 2 to 4 minutes, that it was 32% versus 29% at 1 month survival. This effect held true for good neurological outcomes as well, an adjusted odds ratio of 1.27. And this is interesting because Japan's EMS system is relatively similar to North America's. There's no physicians on board, and the response times were quite good. However, if their protocol is to shock right away, and the authors said that it was, then why were some of them delayed? There's room for confounding there. But delays of 1 to 2 minutes might not be huge complicating factors of the patients themselves. It's hard to say. That's still a pretty significant delay if your number one priority is getting that shock in as soon as you can. So there's definitely some possibility for confounding here, as you would see with any observational data, of course. And of course, you can explain the upsides to either tactic, but it's still not altogether clear which one's the best. This data does seem to favor that you shock as soon as you can. In a spoonful, this national Japanese registry study favored immediate defibrillation during OHCA rather than 2 minutes of CPR before doing your rhythm check. Okay, that's all the articles we have from this week. Let's do a quick wrap up. And from the third article, don't get too worked up about the method and focus on the actual rehydration of sick, malnourished children out of this African study. The biggest takeaway for me was that if you increase their resources by a little bit, you had almost a 7-fold decrease in mortality just by doing that, or estimated. And then from the fifth article, once the defib is ready, you should probably use it. So says this observational study from Japan. The actual answer is complex, but physiologically speaking, you could probably justify both ways. If you are hearing this right now, then you are not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles this week that you would have gotten if you were a member. What are those articles about? Well, we covered a great review on all things chest tubes. We looked at the rates of hematological cancers that are caused by CT scans in children. And then finally, we looked at a huge review article on AI technology and healthcare. Links to all the original articles can be found at journalfeed.org or just follow the links in your show notes. Our goal here is for you to keep up the easy way through spoon feeding. Thank you.